round two. So like we alluded to earlier, authorial voice. So what is it? How do you invoke a distinctive voice without kind of overwhelming the narrative or the characters? And do you even need to have authorial voice? I think we mentioned the first question is, some people, subscribe to the theory of you don't want your writing to sound like writing. So you probably don't want an author voice if that's how you go. So maybe this time, I forget who we started with last time because I went out of the order of my screen. How about we go back to you, Gabi?
Okay. So I made a few notes. I got my little book here.
Very good.
Mostly, I just think it's important well, first, if we're going to define it, in my mind, this sounded like what the reader would picture based on how you write about a character. And I think you can do a lot with point of view, especially if you have multiple characters and you're reading through, their eyes. You're showing what they see. One person could see a priceless artifact and another person could see a dusty thing on a shelf. So I think that's one way to kind of take the author out of it and attribute judgments to the character, what they notice, how they react. And then you also can apply that to how you narrate something. If we all have our biases, and our characters will also have them too. I would be cautioning people to be aware that they could possibly come across as preachy. Some people really have a point to make. It's usually about some social or political thought. Oh, his face. Yes, I hit a nerve. Perfect. So I used to run a critique group, and I have read a lot of some of it. I'm just like, oh dear God,
Sure.
I can definitely understand how this person feels. Like, it's burdensome for the reader. Okay, we know your opinion now. Tell us a story.
Right.
Side of the fact, writing
that's funny. You have that point. That was one of the little things I jotted down too. Was that like you may have a point, and that's fine. Writers have written with points like since the beginning of time, or I guess beginning of language. But if you need to show it through the story, you tell it comes off as that sermon. Gets didactic, and you're just turning people off. You're not getting the point across anymore. They're just going like, okay, this is another story on X, Y, or Z, and yeah.
Right. And then I would also point out, just from my experience in reading other people's work, is that when you create a point of view, when you create a character and you're showing the world through their eyes and you're showing the story through their actions, be consistent. I mean, yes, they're going to be going through an arc, a character arc. They're going to change in some way, but don't give them a Texas twang in chapter 1 and then forget book, right?
You sound like Mark Twain there. That's the kind of thing he would say, only more aggressively.
Maybe in like adjourning, island somewhere, and I could bring over George and we could play music and I could hear some philosophical stylings from Mark Twain.
Very good.
But yeah, that's pretty much what I had. I want people to think about that when they're writing a story, like, hey, you set something up. We're waiting for the gun to go off.
Yeah. Right. Sure. The Chekhov's gun. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that with the accents and the dialect and what have you. Like, I think sometimes people conflate that with like voice. And not that they're completely unrelated, but they can be really overdone. Right. Like I've read stories to where and sometimes it's not the narration. They just have the characters go into such thick accents that I just cannot figure out what they're saying. And I think the sweet spot is get a flair for it. Right. Like, what's a decent example? Not to harp on my own stuff, but I'm a narcissist, so I will. But there was a story, Bermuda Triangle, that's told all through dialogue and action tags. And the lady's British and the guy's an American guy, right? And so I wanted to show, and it's actually horrible for me to try to read it because I can't do a British accent for the life of me. So when I need to like read that one out loud, I just try to give it a flair. But I think that's even writing it is if you can give it that flair, right? And so it's like kind of diction choices, like she says, like hogwash, like some things that you don't normally hear a whole lot. Although like where I'm from, like Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia, we do say hogwash because I guess we're very British, as well. But yeah, I think those little choices, you can kind of give it a flair versus going all in and trying to really capture, this is exactly how that person sound, because it's hard to read it, right? It might be perfectly there, but we have a hard time reading. We start cutting all these letters and things. I think you can cut some. You could probably cut every G and people would know what you're saying, but I think that can be a trap people fall into, at different times, is trying to get too far down the accent or the dialect kind of.
What was that story you wrote, William, where they were wearing, it was during the pandemic and they were wearing masks?
Oh, sure. That was hallmarked at Christmas.
Yeah, but I thought you did such a great job. I mean, speaking of just being consistent, like that was the first thing I read. I'm writing about the pandemic now, but that was the first thing I read that took place during the pandemic. And I was like, wow, he's doing such a great job of just like not beating you over the head with the fact that they're wearing masks, but like subtly reminding you
Sure.
she had to take off her mask, or she lowered her mask, or she did it like, and every time you just hit that like lightly, it brought it all back. It was like, oh, this is where they are. So yeah, kind of to your point, really important to be consistent like that and not to feel as though you have to beat someone over that. Like readers are smart. We pick that up. They are. Very little cues, like.
Right. Yep. No, I think that's a great point. I'm glad you said that, because I think when you underestimate your reader, you do yourself a disservice. Assume they're smart. There might be one or two people that don't get it. Assume they're smart, that they're as smart as you or more. In my case, I assume they're all smarter than me. So I'm like, these people got it. I don't know what I'm doing.
Never go wrong that way. Yeah.
Very good. Did you have anything else you wanted to cover, Gabi? If not, we can transition over to Dario.
Yeah, you guys tell me what you think.
Yeah, Dario, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this is a big and complex question with a lot of tentacles. So the first thing I would say is that a lot of people confuse, and a lot of writers who ought to know better, confuse voice with style. And some even confuse voice with tone. Voice reveals tone, tone being, the attitude that the author has to the material or the character or the issue, the conflict, whatever you like. And there are a lot of voices in some novels. There's authorial voice, which is primarily, I think, the question you were asking.
Sure.
But there's also character narrative voice, which brings in viewpoint, which Gabi was talking about, and character speaking or dialogue voice, which really is a lot more to do with diction. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I mean, there are many books written in limited third-person omniscient where you never have an authorial voice at all. It's all character voice in narrative or in dialogue. Character narrative voice being their interiority, if you like. And that has to align somewhat with the character and their diction. So, if you've got a scene written from the viewpoint of a minimally educated character who left school in 5th grade, they're not only are they not going to say, but they're not going to think he was being really obtuse. They're not going to use big words. They're not going to use. So these things have to align. I'd say that's more pronounced with the diction. And as far as diction goes, back in the 19th century, again, of course, people would try and phonetically capture regional dialogues, and we hate it these days. You know, nobody wants to work through a really strongly written phonetic pronunciation. You do it better, you know, if you want to represent a regional dialogue or a foreign person's speech, you do it better through rhythm and the occasional reveal word. You know, if you have a Russian character, you're going to drop articles a lot of the time. But as far as overwhelming the character with the authorial voice, so if you've got a book where you have authorial narrative, which I use a lot as well, which isn't omniscient, but still you can have authorial narrative in a third person viewpoint book. And I hope I'm not getting too nerdy on this, but I have to deal with these things every day.
Yeah.
We all have to find our own style as writers, and part of style, voice and style are related, if not the same. They're not the same thing, but they're related. So I don't know about voice overwhelming narrative, overwhelming character. Maybe if you get too flowery with it and try too hard, you know. Sure. But as we
I think,
go ahead.
Just to chime in a little.
Please.
I think there's well, there's the time where the author, the quote, the fictional author, quote unquote author of it, is kind of a character in the story. Right. And sometimes they literally are. Yes. You know, you have like The Great Gatsby. It's not all of he's not Gatsby, right? I forget the character's name, but he tells you the whole story. And he has his point of view on the whole thing that happens. And that isn't necessarily a authorial voice because he's not truly the author, but he's the voice, like he's the voice you see everything from. So I think there's that kind of thing. And I think the author can use that. Right, that's a choice that Fitzgerald made, and he's, you know, I don't know if he's. I don't want to say he's what is the terrible thing people do all the now, like the self-insert character that people like to like. I don't know that character is a self-insert, but he is inserted for the author, right? I don't know if that character is supposed to be Fitzgerald or not, but
stand-in.
Yeah, like a stand-in for the author. Yeah, I don't know that it's a egotistical thing necessarily the author's doing, but the author is purposely doing that. Like, I'm telling the story through this character, and that's kind of the voice that the author's coming at it through. And then I think there's like you mentioned, you can have a third person, like now it's the most common thing, right? Is like a third person limited where you get some kind of thoughts and feelings, but mostly you're a little distance. Omniscient people don't use a whole ton anymore, but then maybe you're even, you know, farther, not necessarily so, but maybe a little more broadly to where you hear less of the author's thoughts on it, right? They're trying to give you the information, almost like a journalist, you know, or something, you know, going through it. So I guess it depends on the story you're telling, right? Like I had on a thriller writer, and we were talking about JFK, and I listened to this podcast, and he happened to have a book on it. I'm like, oh, I have to read that now because now I'm for the next 2 weeks I'm obsessed with the JFK assassination. Yes, it was the shiny thing I saw like at that moment, you know. And that way, you know, so it's like he's trying to get that story out, so there's less like the author voice, and it's more kind of the story, you know, like almost getting back to what we were talking about, like it's more cinematic almost in that way. You're just getting more of you hear the characters talk, you get some narration, so you know where everyone's going, you know what's happening, but you don't read it and get any idea what the author thinks of it. Right. Versus other times you can read something and really get a sense for the author's point of view. A lot of
judgment, a lot of attitude. Yeah.
Yeah.
Dario, I'm curious, what do you think the difference between voice and style is, if there is a difference?
That's a really good question, and I'm not sure I can really answer it clearly. I think style is, let's define it as the way we use prose.
Okay.
And the way we turn our prose and us, you know, at a syntax level, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Voice is bigger somehow. I think style contributes to voice, but voice is somehow bigger. And I really need to think about that because I'm not sure I have a simple answer for it. I think it's a really good question. How about you? Do you have?
Well, yeah, I think voice is hard to pin down. I feel like that kind of comes in for me at the macro level when I go back and read it and I can just hear it sort of consistent, because when I'm working on a page, I'm very much in that page. It's hard for me to see the forest through the trees.
That's exactly right. It's a macro level. Yep.
But I will say, like, I feel like you guys have touched on all the things that I agree with here. The only thing I would add is that these days, like, I'm very, very into style, and just weird language and weird syntax. And like, it's very easy for me to do that for its own sake. And so these days, which I don't want to do anymore. So these days, my first step is to try to write what I want to write as simply as possible and as straightforward as possible, so I can start to understand like what I want to talk about and what the content is and what the bigger picture might be. And so that is a very important space for me. And that's the space where I feel like I'm being as honest as I possibly can. And then from there, once I have what I think is important, that's when I start to think about style, think about how I want to put these sentences together. To Gaby's point, how would, this character see this through their eyes? But I mean, I think this is kind of loosely related to the idea of voice. It's very important for me to start now these days from that place of like, how would you say this to a friend? Like how, what is the most straightforward way you could put this? Like, because then I can think about it, right? And I feel like I get lost in the style to begin with, then I lose touch, I lose grounding, and I lose, a sense of like what the bigger picture is, what the message is. So I think, again, kind of going off on a tangent, but for me, when I think of voice, I think of starting from that very like vulnerable and honest and straightforward place, that won't necessarily end up in the project, but like that becomes kind of like the skeleton or the backbone or the basis of the project. So that's where voice starts for me these days, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. That's very well put.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of it a lot of times as like, it's almost like the essence of it. There's a breath, right? There's when you're writing something, at some point you're giving something of yourself to it. I think all writers do, right? No matter what, I think we're giving something of ourselves to what we're writing. I think some writers more than others. Right. I've made I don't want to belabor the point, but I tend to think of it like bleeding, right? That, some writers really bleed for what they're writing, really have, they've really put themselves into it, and other people are a little more standoffish, with it, but it's still getting something of them. And I tend to think of the author's voice as that primal thing, that raw thing that's infused in there, whether you want it or not, versus style can be, it's what point of view you've chosen, the syntax, the diction. I mean, diction's with everything, though. I mean, of course, we're writing, right? So diction's as far as is into everything. But how poetic is the writing, right? I think that's kind of, so you can have writing that's very straightforward, and that writing you don't feel like it's writing. You have other writing that's more the poetic side, down to poetry. But even, Jesse, the stuff I've read of yours, to where it's very infused. I mean, it's prose poetry essentially, and that's the spectrum, and that's all okay. And all of that might be voice, and the voice is infused in all of that, but a lot of that is more just the style you're writing in. And I think a lot of times the voice comes out in how the author actually feels about everything. And I don't always think that, as much as we may try to take ourselves out of it, we do feel some way. And that discernment, all of the judgment calls we make along the way, it's going to come out. And you're gonna feel it.
Choices. You choose to go from this to this to this, And those choices somehow, reveal who you actually are behind the scenes. It's it's just very strange. I think it's hard to define voice. But it's there. We can all sense it for sure. Like you have an ear for prose. That's a great expression because it's true, because you listen and you can hear the voice, and then the voice creates this sort of identity,
Sure.
of the author, even behind the story.
To me, one of the things, I mean, to me, voice goes a huge way towards carrying a story. A good voice is impossible to ignore, and it started with Homer. And it'll carry a story through some.
Are we talking Simpson?
Yep, exactly.
It'll, a strong or well-rounded voice will carry a story through some heavy going, through some flat spots, even, through some slow parts. It's really, to me, it's really underappreciated and a huge component of successful fiction. And people have said to me, how do I know voice, or what is it? You know it when you hear it. You know it because the author might be talking about how a shoe factory works, but you can't stop reading.
Sure.
Right. Yeah.
And that's voice. That's a good voice.
Right.
Agreed.
How do you foster a voice? Right. So if there's someone out there, new or old, I mean, I always think of it like no matter where you are, right, you're trying to grow. I'm always just trying to be the best me I can be, right, the best writer I can be. And I don't know that one of the things I love about art in general is that you don't have a peak, right? Like I love sports, but you're 38 and you're, now they're like, who are we drafting to replace you, right? I mean, before 38 most of the time. You hit 30, and it's like you're hitting the end of the road here. Versus, writing the things, there's no reason like you have to peak at some age. You can peak at different ages. I mean, you could peak at 25 and not get any better, and or you could peak at 65, right? I mean, but how do you foster that voice? Like, how do you not? And I don't mean technically necessarily, although if anyone wants to take it there, that's okay. I mean, how, like, when I have this story I want to write, how do I foster in me as a writer that when I write stories, I have a voice, or
I think you need to care. It kind of comes down to passion. You need to give a damn about what you're saying and the story you're telling. And that'll, and that will come through. It's mysterious, but I think that will be my bottom line off the cuff.
Right. Gabi, you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, I had a little coughing fit. I did my best to mute it.
Oh, no worries. You did a great job muting it. I had no idea.
I think it really, if you can find a way to use real experience behind what you write. I mean, the setting can be anything, but the human emotion. I watched, this isn't normal for me. I'm risking my punk rock reputation right now, but I watched Eras by Taylor Swift the other night. I'm getting over a cold and I'm pretty much zoning out. I did a puzzle and listened to her sing for 3 hours. And she's been doing this for 17 years. And there is a very big change in what she wrote when she was a teenager and what she wrote as a young woman, or even approaching middle age now. And some of it was hilarious. Some of it made me wish that I was born after her so that I could grow up listening to these songs and have better insights into the dating world. Honest to God. Yeah. So I think, the only point I would really make, and that was kind of a clumsy example, but I would definitely say real experience and understanding a problem and being able to demonstrate that in the story. It goes a long way.
Sure.
Yeah. They they answered for me. I think both of what the both things they said at the same time. You have to care, you have to have passion. And these days I'm discovering too, especially what Gaby's saying is like, you know, what's the problem? What's my life? What have I seen? You know, everything, you know, like what is my political view on this? What is, you know, just understanding yourself and understanding like where you're coming from, I think, before you start creating these stories is so important, and it will come through without being preachy, because you still have to, you know, employ all the techniques we're talking about, right? Like seeing through the character's eyes, being consistent, etc. But at the foundation, yeah, I agree 100% with Gaby and the lovely Dario.
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's the other part of it, because we had mentioned like getting preachy and things, you know, even earlier. But I think you have to have passion. You have to have like some life experience. You have to be willing to put yourself into what you're writing, not as a self-insert, but just to put something of yourself into what you're writing. But I think you also need to have a worldview, and you have to have a unique worldview. And I don't mean a wild, like, oh, I think the world's two-dimensional. Like, it doesn't need to be some wild like thing. It needs to be unique, as in it's personal to you. So you have to move past ideology, past here's my political team, past here's my religious team. You have to actually have a view of the world that encompasses all of those things, but that is real to you, that you've thought through. Because if it's just here's my ideology and I think this, and now I'm gonna, like, that's when you end up preaching that, because you don't have, when you come to those choices in the story that may, you know, that's per that character, per what's happening, you don't have a place to come to it besides a stock place, right? And you don't have a voice if you're coming from kind of a stock philosophy or something that's coming at you. So I think a lot. I'd love to listen to. I listen to so much kooky things. The last person I recorded the show wrote a book on Bigfoot, and we talked Bigfoot for like 3 hours. You know, and I loved every second of talking to Bigfoot. But then I'll listen to people talk about, you know, whatever. It could be the newest, you know, political thing out there, whatever. But I think when you open your mind to everything and then kind of form that worldview, it's bound to come out. But you have to really be willing to kind of put yourself out there and be open to thoughts, so that then when you think through them through the story, it comes out kind of naturally. I think authorial voice is really hard to fake. I think that's what we've kind of gotten to. It's very nebulous. It's very hard to put into a box. But I think that's because it has to actually be coming from a real place. And you got to foster that real place.
And I think just adding on to that, I think to me, that's what's so beautiful about being a writer is like, you know, it's a life of rejection. It's a life of like thankless hours. There's very little money. We all know this. But what's so great about it is that like the more open I am to my experience, the more I'm present, the more I'm thinking about my relationships and like really living life richly, the better of a writer I'm becoming, right? So it's like they go hand in hand. I get to live this like incredibly rich life because of that, right? If I don't do that, then I have nothing to offer. I didn't realize that until I started getting older, but now it's like, you know, I write in the morning and then I go out and like, it's great. I can't wait to just like soak it all up like a sponge, you know, look at this situation, look at this character, look at, you know, it's almost subconscious too. I'm just constantly like taking notes in the back of my mind. How cool is that? You get to live like, I mean, it's awesome.
Yeah,
it is. Amen.
But yeah, and I think I may have told you this before, when I was younger and living in LA and I was first starting to get into writing, through a writing workshop, I was taken out with a famous author at that time. It was like my early 20s. And I think I asked her like, you know, what, do you have any advice like for writers? And she's like, don't start writing until you're 30. Like at the time I was like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. What are you talking about? I didn't say that, obviously. But she's 100% right. It's like you get older and you start to, you change. And so you develop and you become more aware and self-aware, you develop this worldview. Then you really start having something to offer, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, I agree.